it's in this context that we read about the three groups among the Nephilim. The one group was the sages, 7 sages, nameless sages. The other group was the Septu, they were the warriors. And then the last group was the builder gods, that's what they were called.
Today we dive into the ancient Sumerian worldview and uncover the 3 orders of the Nephilim, the shining ones, radiant beings tied to fallen gods, giants, and the mysterious origins of human civilization. Through ancient Mesopotamian texts, we'll explore how these accounts may illuminate the biblical Nephilim and the events that unfolded before and after the Great Flood. A very interesting topic. I'm looking forward to discussing it, Willie. So can you please explain who the Shining Ones were in ancient Sumerian stories? You actually discerned 3 groups, Shining Ones among the Nephilim. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so once we go back to the earliest traditions available regarding the Nephilim, we discover that the most important concept or perspective is that of what is called Ut. Now, Ut or U, as I pronounce it, it's like a U, written like a U.
Yes.
It just means day or storm or shining. And it's, in a certain sense, it refers to days, certain kinds of days. A good day, sunny day, a stormy day, an evil day, bad day. And what happened in this case is that the Sumerians didn't only see it with regard to a particular day, as we would today from a modern perspective. They also associated a certain diamond with these days. So now these diamonds that they associated with these days, they were basically classified within the framework of the 3 cosmic realms that the ancients distinguished. The one is the sky or heaven, the other the Apsu, and then the netherworld. So within this framework, what we find is the one group, those that came forth from the Apsu, the diamonds associated with the Apsu was then seen as personages in the form of the sages. So 7 sages.
Yes, so you've got basically the heaven, you've got the underworld, and then you've got the Apsu that fits in between those 2.
So the sages, those are the ones that was associated with the Apsu, and they were regarded as the good days.
Yes.
Good sunny days, and they said it's a nameless group of 7 sages, and they were the ones that taught mankind all sorts of technological insights. Now the other group is that's those that were closely linked, the diamonds that were closely linked with the storm god, and they were regarded as warriors. And that's also the diamonds of the sky. And then we have the diamonds associated with the netherworld. Now, in this regard, what is quite interesting is that the U or the Ut, also the kind of diamond associated with the netherworld developed into what's called the Udug diamond. So that's a very well known, that's basically a general terminology for diamonds in the ancient Sumerian realm. And among these, then, they, coming from the netherworld, were responsible for evil days, and bad things that happened on certain days. So these various groups of diamonds, these 3 groups, were distinguished very early in Sumerian tradition, but especially after the deluge. They were actually ordered within the framework of human society as 3 groups among the Nephilim.
Yeah, so before the flood, they weren't as well structured as after the flood. Is my assumption correct there?
Yeah, so for our information about the time before the flood we don't have a lot of information. It's very scarce, very little that we know. And what we do know is, for example, that the 7 sages existed. It's It's most likely that certain other kinds of U also existed. But once we get to the Uruk period, after the deluge, we find that some of these Uts are closely associated with certain of these Uruk kings. For example, Gilgames, in the Gilgames epic, the 7 sages were closely linked with him, nameless sages, and they were the ones, for example, that advised him with regard to the building of the great walls of Uruk. The warriors were closely linked with Lugalbanda, another Uruk king from Uruk, and in this case they were regarded as the Sabitu, the 7 gods. We've talked about them, that were born on earth in the form of 7 young men that accompanied Lugalbanda towards the land of Arata on his military campaign. So they were closely linked with warriors. And then we also have Enmerkar himself, which is, in my view, simply the biblical Nimrod. And he was responsible for a lot of building work during that period. And then those that were accompanying him and involved in his building work, in that case, the serpent was a very important emblem. He himself is very closely associated with the emblem of the serpent. And the serpent was at the same time also the emblem of the netherworld. The Nazu, the god of the netherworld, he was called King of Serpents. So that means that the kind of diamonds associated with him and the building work most likely would then be those of the netherworld, yes.
Oh, very interesting. And Willie, the U.gal, where does this actually fit into the classification?
Yeah, the U.gal is extremely interesting. So what we have here is a certain U, which is combined with the word gal. And gal means big or huge. So what we have here is these huge U's. So in terms of personifying these days or the diamonds, that would then be our oldest concept of giants within the framework of the ancient world. We also find that I've mentioned the Udug already, and in terms of the Udug, we also find the U.gal, a great Udug, a great diamond of the netherworld. And he's interesting. We find that this diamond is described, for example, in one place in the Udug series, is described as having a towering stature. So he was really regarded as a giant, having a deafening voice and a terrible radiance. So, and
I
this
like that.
link
That sounds fascinating.
yeah, and the link
giant.
between the diamonds and this diamond that is described as a giant and real giants must have been very close, because they probably believed that these diamonds were possessed, the giants, or in some way were incarnated in the giants. We find the same in the biblical tradition of the Rephaim.
Yes.
The terminology Rephaim is used for diamonds that resided in the netherworld. We find that often in the Bible. But we also find that the Rephaim are used to describe certain physical giants.
Yes.
So this is extremely old tradition, going back to the earliest times in Sumer, where these diamonds, these big diamonds, these huge ones, were definitely associated with giants, gigantic figures. And later on in the Akkadian period, we find them among the enemies of the Akkadian emperors in the mountainous areas, especially with regard to the associated with the Hurrians, but that's a story for another day. So the earliest description that we do have, the oldest traditions about giants in the framework of the Nephilim, is then the U.gal. Yeah.
Can you just expand on the term Rephaim and where it comes from? I mean, it features in the Bible as well.
Yeah, so we will have a long discussion on that when we come to the Rephaim. So the Rephaim is mentioned, especially with regard to the biblical Israelites. You know, when they conquered the land of Canaan, before the conquest, some of the spies came across these enormous giants in the land, especially
And they say
in the
they
south.
felt like grasshoppers. Yeah.
Yeah, they were called Anakim, but they were closely associated with the Rephaim, and the Rephaim were then described as giants also. Various passages in the Pentateuch describes them as giants. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
but that's
Isaiah,
much later
yeah, yeah.
than the time that we are talking about.
Still another topic for another time, eh?
Yeah, yeah.
So Willie, the other thing that I wanted to ask you is how do the sages differ from regular human wise men like Adappa, and how does this distinction highlight the sages, I want to say, semi-divine nature in this hierarchy?
So a clear distinction must be drawn between these nameless sages, the earliest group of 7 nameless sages that were born from the Apsu in a supernatural way, most likely at Eridu, the town of the god Enki, the Lord of the Earth. Remember, we've previously discussed his seed that fell on the ground, which is a metaphoric expression for the fallen gods and those gods that were born from that seed. And in later tradition, one of these gods in Zak, he was also regarded as a giant. So it's closely linked. So what we find is that the sages, the nameless sages, later on, in much later tradition, they were also linked with certain human sages. They were given certain names. But one name that is really old is the name Uan, which refers, it just means a heavenly day. And I've already said the good days, heavenly days before the deluge were personified as the sages, the 7 sages. So now what happens is that Adappa is an extremely interesting figure because he is regarded as the first civilizer. In Sumerian tradition, he was definitely a human, but in later Mesopotamian tradition, he is connected with this Uan and even identified with Uan. But I think most scholars would say that Adappa is not the same. It's just a later tradition. So Adappa was human, and he corresponds with the biblical Adam, and which lived in the the earliest of times. Is often seen as the first person, sort of importance in Sumerian tradition with regard to tradition. So. Again, he's a sage, but he's a human sage. So you must distinguish between the human sages that were associated with certain ancient kings before and after the deluge, especially after the deluge, and the group of 7 sages, which were semi-divine, and definitely being Us, they definitely were closely linked to the Nephilim, being regarded as a certain kind of Nephilim.
Yes. So the other thing that I wanted to sort of just revisit, we did mention Etana previously. How does Etana's story parallel Enoch? And I know we've mentioned Enoch in the past as well. And does the eagle versus serpent conflict in the Etana story actually reveal divisions in those Shining Ones hierarchies?
Yeah, so the name Etana means he that went to heaven, or he that went to God. And in the earliest of times, the story was told that he was taken by the eagle to the heaven of the supreme God. In this case, in my opinion, it probably refers to the spirit of the supreme God, the eagle that took him to the abode of the supreme God, and he definitely corresponds with Enoch in biblical tradition. Now, what is interesting about the story of Etana is that we find this conflict between the eagle and the serpent. So on the one hand, the eagle was associated with Etana and with Kish, where Etana was king, because Etana was a Semitic king. On the other hand, the serpent was closely associated with Eridu. I've already talked about Eridu, the city of Enki, which is closely linked with the seed that fell on the ground, which we have linked to the fallen gods already in a few previous episodes, and also the giants. So on the one hand, we have Enoch, on the other, we have the giants and others like the sages, also called Apkallu, which taught humans all these techniques that they didn't know about according to the Sumerian and later on traditions that's found in the Book of Enoch. So what we find here is something very similar to what we later on find in the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is much later. It's about 3,000 years after the deluge. But it did took elements from Babylonian tradition. For example, it did took from Mesopotamian tradition the idea that the whole idea of the giants. Many scholars believe that goes back to the Apkallu. And we find that the things that the watchers taught the humans, for example, the secrets of mythology and weapon making, cosmetics and adornment.
Pharmakia, all of that.
Yeah, sorcery and magic, astrology, divination, all these things that we read about in the Book of Enoch actually goes back to the sages that taught certain, provided certain knowledge to the humans.
And I think it's really worthwhile. It's worthwhile that we do a whole episode on the Book of Enoch. So something for the guys that follow us to look forward to.
Yeah, and other scholars actually see the giants in the Book of Enoch as taken from the Udug that I've mentioned previously. And especially in this regard would be the U.gal, the large Udugs, which is definitely described as giants. But what we find in the Book of Enoch is that it borrows Babylonian traditions, very old traditions, but the author of the Book of Enoch tries to bring all these Babylonian traditions together in a certain way with the biblical tradition about the Nephilim. But now what we've discussed is we do find in the antediluvian period, Enoch was an important figure in the Babylonian or Mesopotamian Sumerian tradition. He was called Etana. And on the other hand, he was associated with the eagle. On the other hand, the serpent, closely linked with with Enmerkar, which corresponds with the biblical Nimrod, and the city of Eridu in the time before the deluge already. We had this very ancient mythos of the seed that fell on the ground, the fallen gods, and all the things that we've already discussed in terms of the Nephilim that was associated with Eridu, the Apkallu, the sages, the seven sages, and most likely other kinds of Uds or Us, like the U.gal, the giants.
So, Willie, if you look at the Sumerian ideas, how does that help us to better understand the Book of Enoch, especially when you look at angels falling, fathering giants, and teaching advanced technologies?
Yeah, so Enoch is very important in the Book of Enoch. He's a central figure. And I have no doubt that what is told about him was borrowed from Babylonian tradition with regard to Etana.
Yep.
So Enoch endeavors to intervene with God on behalf of the fallen watchers, which is just another name for the angels, but to no avail, because God has decided to send the deluge in order to destroy them. And then Enoch visits heaven and other cosmic realms in the form of travels, visions, dreams. And again, these things are clearly based on the traditions that evolved around Etana. So the Book of Enoch took a lot from ancient Babylonian tradition, but even though the Book of Enoch is late, is not a credible source about the antediluvian period, in our reconstruction of the antediluvian period, we do find the figure of Enoch. We have good reason to believe that the giants were definitely present within that framework, at least in terms of ancient Sumerian tradition. The Apkallu was present. They were linked with the seven sages. They were linked with Eridu in that antediluvian period. So these motives are definitely very, very old, going back to that early period.
So when we talk about the Book of Enoch, is it something that we can use as just a resource? And how serious do you think we should take the Book of Enoch?
Well, the Book of Enoch, I think, is a kind of historical fiction. And nowadays we find authors that use a certain historical setting for a story. And this is very much what we find. It's a fiction, and it borrows a lot from Babylonian traditions, as I've already mentioned, and reconstruct a kind of story about the ancient world and what it would have been in the time before the deluge. But it's definitely not an authentic tradition going back to that period that was delivered in Israelite circles. This is definitely not the case, because we do know it was borrowed from the Babylonians during the exile. That's about 600, 500 BC.
Yeah, beautiful. It definitely makes for an interesting read.
Well, it's a fascinating book and fascinating ideas.
Yes.
And it definitely adds to, the mystery around the Nephilim and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. So Willie, and this is the question I've been looking forward to asking you. What inspired your unique view of the Nephilim as a tripartite hierarchy of sages, warriors, and builders, rather than just this sort of destructive offspring of fallen angels that we seem to be fed through mainstream media?
Yes, I think when one studies the ancient world, as I have done, I've been carefully studying the ancient traditions, the oldest sources. We've discussed the Edfu tradition in Egypt in a previous episode, where we find the Nephilim traditions were actually handed down and brought from Mesopotamia to Egypt. We've also discussed the traditions within the ancient framework of Mesopotamian tradition, Sumerian tradition during the Uruk period. And what I discovered was a very close correspondence between the Egyptian and the Sumerian tradition. Now, in the Egyptian tradition, we also find the idea, the motive of fallen seed, and the gods born from that seed, 8 gods, actually 4 gods and 4 goddesses, exactly the same as in the Sumerian tradition. In Egypt, we also find a messianic figure, the peeing god, that was born from these gods, clearly a very early Nephilim Messiah. And then the deluge happened. And then after the deluge, some of these, somehow, according to the Egyptian tradition, maybe people linked or knew what happened, etc., went back to their original homeland that was destroyed by the deluge and went in search for certain items that they have stolen away before the deluge, and to actually bring the gods of the antediluvian period back to life. And then it's in this context that we read about the 3 groups among the Nephilim. We find they were called brethren. They were called the children of Tannan, 3 groups. The one group was the sages, 7 sages, nameless sages. The other group was the Septu. They were the warriors. And then the last group was the builder gods. That's what they were called. And they correspond exactly with what we find in ancient Sumerian tradition with regard to the 7 sages, the Sabiti, the 7 warriors that I've already mentioned, and also the builder gods in terms of what happened in the time of Enmerkar, and also maybe what I've mentioned, these gigantic kind of diamonds that we've spoken about. Maybe they also played a role with regard to both the warriors, but especially also the builder gods. And the close correspondence between these 2 traditions enabled me to reconstruct these 3 orders within the framework of the final days and the days after the Uruk period came to an end during the time of Gilgamesh. I believe that was when this whole ordering system came into being, and when these diamonds were associated with these groups, and these groups formed the basis for the caste kind of system that came into being, and I believe that happened in Uruk in the time of Gilgamesh.
Yeah. I find it fascinating if you look at these traditions and how it sort of, I want to say, migrated, whether it's oral traditions or written traditions, they were very, very powerful, which tells me personally that it's not just little light stories. There's something behind it that's a lot more ancient, a lot more powerful. Yeah.
So these traditions can be followed throughout the ages.
Yes.
And we have a continuous tradition from ancient Sumerian times. I've already mentioned those traditions were taken to Egypt. They were also taken to Canaan, where we find the Anakim that the biblical authors describe. They were taken to the Mediterranean, into the Mediterranean region, where we have a lot of evidence or stories about these giants, and it was even taken to Europe. And I follow certain families and later on bloodlines with regard to those carrying these Nephilim
And
traditions.
that's why it's very important, people that have an interest in the topic, to read the trilogy as well. So
Yeah.
just sort of direct them in that
Described
direction.
in the trilogy, absolutely.
Described in the trilogy. So, Willie, finally, in the framework of the Grail legends, which sort of touches on what we just said, where hidden lineages, secret knowledge, and knightly warrior protectors play key roles, how do these orders of the Nephilim resonate with modern terminology like the elite bloodlines, shadow cabals, and hidden influencers? And specifically with reference to our 9 Ages model.
Yeah, so we find the 3 orders of the Nephilim very well defined in Roman times, the time of Jesus, with regard to certain mystery religions. The Mithraists, for example, the Orpheus, and then the Hermenetic tradition. These traditions, these 3 different streams of tradition correspond with the 3 groups among the Nephilim. Then later on in the Grail legends, Grail romances, we also find definite, clearly distinguished features between these different tales, romances. On the one hand, we have Parsifal and the kind of way that he is presented.
The pure fool.
The warrior, the warrior caste. And then we have Gawain. He is also a warrior, he's a knight, but love is his area, his domain.
He should have been the
fool. So this is the other group that's closely associated with Gilgames and originally the priestly order. And then the third group, the third knight that's related to these orders, Galahad, and he is closely linked with the different skills and so forth. For example, the ship of Solomon that plays an important role in his stories. Woodcutters and so forth. So he's very closely linked to those traditions. So the 3 orders are definitely present within the framework of Europe, medieval Europe, and then later on, these 3 orders continue to exist, and today we can clearly distinguish them within the framework of secret societies. And later on, when we come back, when we reach that point, towards the end of the 3rd volume, in the last age that we're living in, we will have more detailed discussions regarding that.
Fantastic. The one thing that always sort of interests me is that there is a golden thread that runs from the beginning of time right through into Revelation. And when you look at something, you just have to find the golden thread. And that's where the truth lies in these things. So just to quickly recap, these 3 orders, Willie, link ancient Sumerian and Egyptian myths to biblical Nephilim. And it just gives us that wonderful complete view of pre and post flood impact. Like I said, that runs right through everything, but specifically our 9 ages of history as well. So any final comment?
So we plan to go slowly but steadily throughout the ages and discuss all these different aspects and orders in great detail once we get to that particular period. But at least we have now given an overall view and perspective, and with the focus on the earliest period when these 3 orders first originated.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask people again, if you like the content, please like and subscribe and share. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask us. Thank you, Willie.
I'm really looking forward towards the questions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.